What you just witnessed was the Patagonia roll cast, or the Belgian cast, or the Belgian wind cast, or the constant pressure cast, all pretty much the exact same thing. We just attach different names depending on whether you're in Belgium or Patagonia, apparently. So the key principle here is that that line has to stay tight and connected under tension to your rod the entire time. I'm going to explain on location with some casts on the video, and then we'll let you watch that. And then we'll come back to the studio and I'll explain a little bit more. But as you watch these clips, just notice that that rod never stops moving. There can be a little bit of a pause there, but what we're really looking to do is keep that line under tension the entire time. As soon as we stop, like in a traditional cast, that's when the wind gains control and that cast is lost forever, and you'll be lucky to even hit the water sometimes with that. So follow along. I'll explain in the water, and then we'll jump back in the studio and I can unpack a bit for you.
I know the wind is probably blowing out the mic, but that's the whole idea. We're fishing in an extremely windy situation today. And I want to share with you a cast called the Patagonia roll cast. Much of the time we're fishing, we'll have a tailwind, which is great. But what the tailwind does is I go to make a back cast and it collapses and I've got a bunch of slack in my line, and although I might get it to go out, I'm not very accurate. The goal is to keep the line tight the whole time. So when I make this cast, I want to take my rod tip out to the side in a half circle, and I'm never going to stop. I'm just going to take my rod tip out and I can throw forward very powerful. But the key is I've got to keep moving. It's almost like a D-loop in spey casting, and the line is under constant pressure. If I stop and start, that's then when the wind will get control, and maybe my fly blows way out of the way. So I'm just going to come back wide, forward tight. Back wide, forward tight, and that line is under constant tension. Not only do I get the distance I want, but I wind up with an extremely straight cast with a lot of control because I keep that line tight the entire time. I'll show you a couple more angles on that, but that's the Patagonia roll cast. The goal is to just keep the line tight the entire time rather than try to make a back cast into the wind, which will just get collapsed, cause a whole bunch of slack, makes a big mess. It works pretty well, and it actually allows me to make a cast without the full length of a back cast like that. So I'll show you a couple more angles on that and kind of how the arm motion works.
As you watch this cast in slow motion, the main takeaway is that we're trying to bring that rod out back wide and forward tight, and that eliminates a lot of midair collisions. And also just notice that that rod tip in the rod really never stops moving throughout the stroke. Something to take note of here is that my rod tip comes up and rises before I start to accelerate back. My rod is up, then I accelerate back. So you saw a couple of different angles there of the cast in action. And the main thing to keep in mind is that when we have a wind, one, we want to position ourselves to try to take advantage of the wind if we can. So oftentimes if you just pivot, say 10 or 15 degrees, you can get that wind as a right-hander blowing slightly from left to right and somewhat of a tailwind. That's ideal. So as you stalk trout, sometimes just changing where you stand the tiniest bit allows you to use a cast like this where I'm casting with the wind. It's very helpful. So don't always feel like you have to have these harsh crosswinds, because a right to left wind is going to be a little bit different as a right-hander. Then I would really need to bring my rod way out to the side so that wind doesn't blow into me. But if I can get that wind to be a straight tailwind, or ideally a left to right, just by pivoting my position in the river a little bit, that's excellent. With this cast, if we try to go back and forth in kind of a scissor stroke plane like this, where I'm just straight, that wind is just going to collapse that back cast. I'm going to wind up with a pile of slack in the air, and that's how I hook myself in the head where my fly gets tangled around the rod tip, which still happens to me sometimes too. But by bringing that rod wide to the side and having a really aggressive cast, I can really just have the same length of back cast, but it's going to be rounded in nature, because it would be impossible in a stiff tailwind to get my line to shoot all the way back out straight and tight. That would be nice, but it's not going to happen. So I raise my rod, I accelerate wide coming back, And then I bring my arm in nice and tight because that's where my power is. And then I drive forward with great force coming forward. But the main thing is don't stop. Sweep around. There's a tiny pause right here. You could even break your wrist a tiny bit and then close the hatch like so, and then drive forward with a nice powerful cast. It's a Belgian wind cast or a constant pressure cast. The name constant pressure is just so intuitive because we want that line tight the entire time. As soon as we lose connection with that line and that tension, that's when the wind gains control and my cast becomes inaccurate and unsatisfying and inconsistent. So it's a great way to deal with tailwinds and take advantage of them. Get that rod up, back wide, forward tight. Don't stop moving. It's a great cast. And as you can see on the video, we can still develop really nice, tight, clean loops instead of just lobbing the fly with a tailwind, which can wander all over the place and become inaccurate. Just casting far in a tailwind isn't the goal. Casting accurately with good loop control where we could cast up under branches, up against the bank, and hit targets that are very small, even though our line is much harder to control during the course of the cast. So there you go. That's the Patagonia roll cast. I hope that's helpful next time you're dealing with the wind.